Hello, everyone, and welcome to our In Conversation with Mason Chair and Academy Professor at Fisher College of Business, Ohio State University. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Doug Lambert. And let me tell you a little bit about his achievements here, because when I mentioned Academy Professor, only 3% of the faculty at Ohio State University, 3% of the emeritus professors actually achieved this title. Now, I don't need to tell many of the supply chain sort of academic world that Academy Professor Doug Lambert is seen as one of the forefathers of supply chain thinking. His work has been published globally, and he is one of the most cited professors on ResearchGate at the university. So that makes him one of the most read and cited professors at the university. Now, without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Doug Lambert. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So Doug, over to you. Tell me a little bit about how you sort of entered into the world of supply chain management.
Well, I was born in Toronto, Canada, and I got my undergraduate degree in MBA at Ivy Business School, and I was teaching there with an MBA to make sure I was going to like it before I invested in the PhD. And they were saying they needed to hire somebody in this new area of physical distribution. And so when I went to Ohio State for my PhD, I was a marketing major, but a physical distribution minor. And that was a packaging decision. I took as much coursework in physical distribution with really one of the grandfathers of this business, Bud Lalonde. Martin Christopher talks about how Bud's visits to England caused him to switch to logistics from consumer behavior area in marketing. And so I took as much coursework in the physical distribution area, but I was planning to go back to Canada. And I thought there'd be more jobs for a marketing professor who could teach logistics than a logistician who could teach marketing. So it was a packaging decision. I lasted 9 months back in Canada after I got my PhD. I had a chance to go to Michigan State or Penn State. Michigan State was where my mentor, Bud Lalonde, had graduated from and where he'd served on the faculty. So I took the Michigan State job and have been in the US ever since. So that's really how I got into the area. I wasn't sure what it was when I took my first course. I just knew if I wanted to go back to Canada to the Ivy Business School that I'd have a better chance if I was up on this new area of physical distribution, which then became logistics, right? The professional organization back then was called National Council of Physical Distribution Management. Then it became the Council of Logistics Management. More recently, the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals.
Yeah, and we've seen how, you know, supply chain management over the years has been sort of pimped and changed, and some would argue, you know, unnecessarily, you know, it's been sort of reworked as a concept. But I mean, on the whole, we could say, like, you know, I mean, logistics and supply chains have been there for, you know, for generations, right? But it was Booz and Hamilton back in 1982 that coined the term supply chain management. So tell me a little bit about your career at the point that this term was coined by those guys then.
Well, I was still teaching logistics back in '82 and still doing research on customer service, how you set service levels that would give you a competitive advantage so that you didn't have to be the lowest cost. You could provide more value by offering better service. I mean, if you actually go back, I used this Weber article in a PhD seminar where we looked at sort of the evolution of the area. And what they were really talking about, the title of the article was Supply Chain Management, Logistics Catches Up with Strategy. I mean, they were saying that you needed to manage across functions within the firm and across firms. So they were really talking about logistics properly implemented, used a new name for it, which is what consultants do, right? This old friend of mine who died this year, unhappily, Jay Sterling used to say, there's a lot of old wine in new bottles.
Well said.
So the old definition of physical distribution was the integration of two or more of these activities from point of origin to point of consumption. And inventory and transportation were examples of the activity. The problem is if you only had two of them implemented, you didn't have integrated anything. But the key idea was it was always a supply chain orientation because it was from point of origin to point of consumption, right? So it was always dirt to dirt. I mean, no one's naive enough to believe point of origins when it shows up on your dock, and point of consumption is when you ship it. Although in the old days, that's how they used to measure service. An on-time shipment was when you shipped it, but the customer was measuring it based on whether they received it on time, right? So it required a whole change of perspective in how measurements were made.
Yeah.
So I worked on logistics until 1992, when I was encouraged by Gary Ridenour from 3M. And 3M over the years had spent over $1 million on research projects with us at the universities I was teaching at. And a guy named Al Rose from Johnson & Johnson had also funded research. Al took me all over the world to present the results, Bali, Indonesia, Vienna, Austria, Manila in the Philippines. The weird thing is I never saw anybody from any other universities, and he was funding all kinds of university projects. But at any rate, Al and Gary encouraged me to start a research center that I was thinking about, and we did in the spring of 1992. And the idea was that the companies would all be non-competitors, that for the $20,000 a year fee that they would pay, we would work on research that they as a group thought was critical for their long-term success. And what this did was, because most of my research had been corporate funded projects, and when somebody pays for a project out of an operating budget, they want the work done yesterday. So oftentimes we didn't have time to write articles from the work. We were on to the next project to keep the machine going, right? There were faculty I'd committed to bio to teaching, students that were working with us. And so this gave me a chance for thoughtful introspection, right? Longer term projects. And again, we thought originally we would have 25 companies, but they liked the intimacy. We said 2 people from a company could come to the meetings. So if somebody couldn't make it, the company would be represented. And we decided to keep the group small. We'd cap it at 15. They said, if you find you can't do the research with 15, then we'll have a decision to make. Do we pay more in annual dues, or do we let more people in? And we were always able to work within that $300,000 a year budget. So the first project they wanted to work on was collaboration. They said, we're not good at this. And the companies were 3M, Johnson & Johnson, AT&T Network Systems, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Whirlpool. You get the idea. They're all pretty good companies. And they said that our survival long-term is going to depend on whether we can collaborate with key customers and suppliers, and we're not good at it. We get involved in these relationships. We call them partnerships. There's all kinds of excitement at the beginning. Most of them are bad marriages that end in divorce. So what they did was they gave us 18 good partnerships that we could learn from. And this took a couple of years because we interviewed multiple people on each side of each relationship. For 3M and Target, we did 35 total interviews. And the interesting thing is all the research that had been done up till that point in time had been a survey sent to one individual on one side of the relationship, right? Well, we found that people in the same company had different views of the relationship, never mind the other side, right? So, and the sad thing is most academic research since ours has been a survey going to one person on one side of the relationship, right? So it hasn't improved from an academic standpoint, but we learned a lot from these case studies. So we had a couple of thousand pages of transcripts. We wrote a case on every one of these relationships. The only people who saw the cases were the companies involved. So the only people who saw McDonald's and Coke were McDonald's and Coke. The only people who saw 3M and Target were 3M and Target. And we decided of these 18 relationships that 2 were better than the rest. We call them best in class, right? And we decided some weren't partnerships at all. There was one between Johnson & Johnson Hospital Services and UPS for overnight package service. Both sides called it a partnership, but it wasn't a partnership at all. It was simply a single source contract with volume guarantees. Both sides got what they wanted. They got the win-win, right? So they called it a partnership, but it was simply good business. UPS would have done the same thing for anybody who gave them that volume of business. There was no customizing. So then of the ones that were partnership, they weren't the same. So we figured out that what's happening here is we're using one word, kind of like supply chain management, to describe different things, right? You say partnership, you see a picture. I say partnership, I see an entirely different picture, right? And so when we wrote the Harvard Business Review article in 2004, our editor, Julia Kirby, said, if your latest so-called supply chain partnership has failed to live up to expectations, perhaps it's because you didn't state them in the first place. So I say to you, let's have a partnership. We've been doing business for 10 years, and you say, great idea, but I don't tell you what success is for me. You don't tell me what success is for you. So we can't agree on a joint plan, right? We can't decide these are goals for our joint relationship, develop a plan to get there. Because we have no plan, we don't get there, and then we're both upset. We say, well, she said she wanted a partnership. What the hell's the matter with it, right? And so because they were different, we called them type 1, type 2, type 3. Why was that important? Because you resource them differently. A type 3 McDonald's, Coke, CEO to CEO annual business reviews. You share your corporate strategies. The metrics are different than they are for a type 1, where you might share your production schedule, right? The level of people involved are different. The metrics are different. And so that helped clear up some of the confusion. We wondered if we should come up with a different definition, because one of the companies in the group was Texas Instruments, and their lawyers wouldn't let them call any of these relationships partnership because there's a legal definition of a partnership, right? So we had to call them type 1, type 2, type 3 alliances for Texas Instruments. So out of that, again, I'd have stopped then. I'd have said, this is what makes it a partnership. These are why partnerships fail: unrealistic or unstated expectations going in. The expectations might be realistic, we just didn't state them, right? And so the forum members said, we were hoping there'd be a tool, right? Something we could use to determine if this relationship ought to be a partnership or not. And if it ought to be a partnership, what kind of partnership? So that's when we developed the partnership model, which we've used in day-and-a-half meetings over 100 times around the world. We've used them in Europe. The partnership model in Europe, we've used it in Asia Pacific and North and South America. In complex relationships like Coke and Cargill, we had 25 executives from each company in the day-and-a-half meeting. And we took them for the first half day and put them in 2 separate rooms with a separate facilitator and got them to articulate their business reasons for wanting a closer relationship with the folks on the other side around 4 driver categories. When we finished at noon, this might have been the first time ever that Coke ever had a common vision for what success with Cargill would look like, and the same for Cargill. So then what we did is we brought them together and they had to present to each other and decide which drivers from each list they could pick up as joint goals for the relationship and develop a plan for going forward. So see, we're setting expectations, which was the problem for why these relationships were disappointments. So from that research, they said, well, we've done that now. Let's get on to something else. And we looked at how you measure and sell value, because for most of my career, I taught in logistics, and the mistake I'd seen logistics executives make is they tell top management about inventory reductions and warehouse reductions, asset reductions, and they talk about cost savings in transportation or other things, right? And they train executives to look for a big pot of gold at the end of each year. Well, these pots of gold get harder to find, the better yet, right? And so what they were missing was they weren't turning service improvements into revenue enhancements that they could tie to profit improvement, so they could get away from simply talking about cost reductions. And, I've said this many times, long term, no company is ever cost cut its way to prosperity. You eventually have to grow the business. It's all about, growing sales to grow profit, right?
Yeah.
So from that, we went on to this cross-functional, cross-firm view of supply chain management. And what was going on with the forum members at the time, they were all complaining about how in their companies, the functions had their own metrics and didn't act like they worked for the same shareholder. And we had to find some way to get the functions to act like they played on the same team. And that's where we came up with these 8 cross-functional business processes, right? One is customer relationship management, which provides the structure for how you segment customers and decide which ones are critical for your long-term success, right? And similar with supplier relationship management. And for these key relationships, you don't want one salesperson talking to one buyer because you can't find 2 people good enough. You want cross-functional teams interacting, right? You want salespeople talking to salespeople. You want R&D folks talking to R&D folks, finance people talking to finance people, logistics people talking to logistics people, et cetera. And then the other processes are all coordinated through this CRM, SRM linkage. Customer service management, which sounds like customer service in logistics, but isn't. It's proactive. You build triggers and signals into your system so you can identify service failures before they happen, correct them so the customer never sees them. Demand management, which isn't just forecasting, it's stopping all those crazy things we do that make it hard to forecast, right? Like end of quarter loads. Order fulfillment, manufacturing flow management, new product development, commercialization, and returns management. And our returns management process included a concept that hadn't appeared in the literature, although I'm sure companies were doing this, called avoidance. If we're causing the return, we want to stop doing it, right? So if some purchasing agent went out and bought a cheaper part, and now we're getting machines returned because that part's failing at a higher rate, we want to go back and fix that with the supplier. If the supplier can't fix that part, then we shift the business to another one, right, that can get it right. So these 8 processes, then, we believe have to be implemented within a firm and then linked up across firms in the supply chain. There's one other model out there that has cross-functional, cross-firm processes, and that's the SCORE model. But the SCORE model is plan, source, make, deliver. And it includes 3 business functions, where our framework includes all business functions, right? And we're talking about managing relationships, where the SCORE model ignores relationships. It's all about transaction efficiency. And the links in the SCORE model are the sellers deliver with the buyer's source. Now again, you want to make sure that you get that right, but that's only the beginning of the relationship, it seems to me. I mean, I could ask undergrad students, how would you measure supplier performance? And they'd say things like lead time and on-time delivery and fill rate, because most of them were logistics students. But then I'd say, well, what else? Well, if they helped us improve our product quality so we can sell the same amount of product at a higher price because it's better quality, or more product at the same price because it's higher quality. Have they helped us innovate with new products, right? So they got all these ideas for things we ought to be looking at in a supplier that are totally missed in the SCORE model, right? So, and you hear this all the time. My friend Martin says this, that it's no longer company against company, it's supply chain against supply chain. And I know what people are trying to say. Nobody's good enough to make it alone. This is a complicated world. You need good suppliers and good customers. But in most supply chains, for major corporations, There's overlap in suppliers and customers. I mean, Coke and Pepsi both buy rail car after rail car of sweetener from Cargill. They buy packaging from Amcor, and they sell to Kroger grocery store. So this isn't an A team playing a B team. This is like you got a soccer match, and every 15 minutes, some of the players change jerseys and start playing for the other side, right? I mean, when does that happen? So it really isn't supply chain against supply chain. It's all about relationship management. If Coke manages relationships better than Pepsi, Coke's going to win more often. If Colgate manages relationships better than Procter and Unilever, Colgate's going to win more often because they buy laminates from for their toothpaste from the same guys. They buy packaging materials, from the same guys. They buy the abrasives for their toothpaste from the same big global guys, and they sell to the same retailers. So supply chain management's all about relationship management. And the partnership model, and another tool we've developed more recently called the collaboration framework, which you can do in a day instead of a day and a half, helps you develop a plan for your relationship for the next 18 to 24 months. They're tools for managing these relationships. And when we worked on the partnership model initially, we had no idea it was going to be a piece of this bigger supply chain management puzzle, but turned out it was. So I guess the takeaways for this session would be that we need to be thinking in broader terms than cross-functional with 3 business functions. And the pandemic should have made that clear. When you try to manage a network of companies, which is a supply chain, with 3 business functions, purchasing, operations, and logistics, all measured on how much money did you save me this year, you got trouble coming, right? I mean, that explains how key portions of critical supply chains got outsourced to single sources located in a communist dictatorship. What the hell could possibly go wrong? Well, we found out, right? Try to get the PPE, try to get ventilators, right? And even drugs. I mean, if you want vitamin C, where does it come from? I mean, how could this happen? So who ought to be responsible for supply chain management? The leadership team of the company. Because we have to decide what suppliers are key, what suppliers are going to get us where we need to go, right? And they're going to help us innovate with new products. They're going to help us be the best we can be for our customers. And who are those key customers? Now, that's what business we're in. Who ought to make that decision if it's not the leadership team of the company? And the focus, well, we're not against cost reduction. Sure, get them if you can. But the focus ought to be on value co-creation to drive revenue and profitability. Now, talking about, one of the things you mentioned to me earlier was like, skills for supply chain managers. Well, again, I suppose anybody who works in a company, you could call a supply chain manager, I suppose, but because every company is part of a supply chain, whether they choose to recognize it or not, or manage it, right? And so we need to invest in helping people develop the functional skills. I mean, Hammer used to talk about obliterate the silos, knock them down. But, that's what the military does. People get hurt when you start knocking things down. And all of the expertise to run the business resides in the silos. If you're going to make things, you need to have people who know how to run a factory. And likewise, you need to have people who know how to run a warehouse or make transport decisions. And even if you outsource it, you outsource the lifting, you need to keep the thinking inside. People need to know what's going on. So those skill sets have to be developed. The real trick is getting them all to work together, right, on these cross-functional teams, where you include sales and marketing, as difficult as it might be to involve them, new product development and commercialization, and finance people, so they don't keep coming up with screwy ideas to make short-term profits look better that undermine long-term relationships with key customers and suppliers. So the segmentation that goes on in CRM and SRM is key. And then once you've identified these critical relationships, then what you need to do is develop the bonds, and the partnership model and the collaboration framework are two tools that help do that. I can provide you with chapter 1 from the book if you think that would be useful for people who might, you might put it with the video, who want to know more about the framework.
Absolutely. I'm sure our viewers, now that you've mentioned that, will probably be jumping at the chance to be downloading your work, Doug, because it's been fascinating to listen to you, Doug, and I could listen to you, and I think we should be creating several more episodes with you, perhaps in the near future. But I think if you were to leave maybe one lasting thought, I mean, we've had the whole world over, everybody has experienced risk like never before. You know, I'm talking about COVID. Underlying that, we've had a lot of political upheavals around the world as well. As you know, my research expertise has been within the realm of supply chain risk management. So, you know, it's been pretty fascinating in my career to be working on a topic that is always high interest. But this year, I would say, has been like none other before. So, given the kind of uncertainty and upheavals that we've all been facing, you know, not just in the supply chain world, but even in individual personal lives, what we've seen is that supply chain has moved from the boardroom to the dining room. I would say everybody around the world knows the phrase supply chain management today, and that's a pretty good thing for our profession. If you were to leave just one maybe lasting thought for our viewers and for our listeners, what would that be, Doug?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I had a PhD student tell me that even his grandmother knew what supply chain management was. Now, I think his grandmother has heard the words. Whether she actually knows what supply chain management is an entirely different proposition, right? And I don't know what the news has been like in Europe, but if you watched it here, every time they talked about supply chain, they'd show a warehouse, a truck on the road, or somebody stocking a shelf in a retail store. And those are all critical activities. I don't mean to diminish them at all. But you saw supply chain management maybe in the works, excuse me, when there was a 60 Minutes show where they were taking two old auto plants, abandoned auto plants, and converting them into ventilator factories. And Mary Barra from General Motors and Bill Ford from Ford were very much hands-on because they were developing supply chains. Yeah, they were making stuff in a factory, but that's not the supply chain man. They had to source all these materials, right, that they'd never sourced before as an auto company. And they had a whole new set of customers that had to get this stuff. And both CEOs were very much hands-on, right? They weren't leaving it up to plant folks or purchasing people to figure this out. And the other thing I noticed was Bill Ford's face was all red. And I said to my wife, look at his face. And the bridge of his nose looks like it's been bleeding. And then they showed a picture of him in a Ford plant, right? And he's got one of those 3M N95 masks on. So then I thought, well, gosh, he looked like a lot of those hospital workers who've been wearing one of those N95 masks for 12 or 14 hours. They're not made for that. And I couldn't help but wonder if Mike Roman, the CEO of 3M, was watching the same 60 Minutes show and was thinking what I was thinking. There's an opportunity for a new N95 mask for people who have to wear them long term that doesn't beat their face up. We can make it in the US and sell it for a premium price, right? That's what supply chain management's really about, right? It's leadership coming from the top. It's how do we grow the business? It isn't cut costs, cut costs, cut costs. So when people wear your product, their face is destroyed, right? And so I think it's a whole different way of looking at the business. It's how do we work with our key suppliers, key customers, continue to innovate and make good products that provide value. And they don't have to be the cheapest. They have to be the ones that provide the most value. I think that's the key.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor Doug Lambert. As always, it's been brilliant to talk to you, Doug. And I want to thank you for your time, for your words. Your work, your research has impacted not just the business world, but so many academics, so many researchers around the world. You know, your work on partnerships and supply chain management. I mean, it's leaves a legacy with many people to learn and understand, to unpack supply chain management in a simple way. I know personally your work has impacted so many around the world, and I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart to join me here today as my first expert on our conversation series, Supply Chain Thought Leadership series. So thank you so much, Doug.
Well, thank you. My pleasure.